Palworld has become famous overnight for allowing you to force Pokemon to do slave labor to create military-grade rocket launchers. Palworld is often touted as an ARC survival crafting, satisfactory Pokemon with guns with some sprinkles of Elden Ring on top kind of game, which is true for most of your time playing the game until it slowly morphs into a rock mining simulator. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This game takes inspiration from everything imaginable and just sort of mushes them all together, so much so that people think they should be sued for it. It's like they made a cake that includes all of your favorite foods and said, that's illegal. Some aspects look a bit on the line of what may or may not be acceptable, like potentially stolen assets, but I'll leave that to Nintendo's lawyers, who are infamously good at sending out cease and desist notices. I'm most interested in talking about what the end result of Palworld is, because instead of becoming a disgusting, inedible monstrosity with a lawsuit, what really emerged was somehow just an incredibly fun game. Especially for the first 40 hours or so, the pacing in the beginning is great, and doing everything from building a base to exploring and catching pals is really enjoyable. It's surprisingly exceptional for an early access game and is worth every dollar if you're into Pokemon or survival crafting games. The only problem is after you finish eating all the good parts of this deliciously weird cake, you eventually end up with a simulator for mining rocks, to make guns and bullets to shoot at giant damage sponges while running through the same exact copy and paste dungeon and boss fights. So if any lawsuit is to occur, it should probably be for what Palworld did to its endgame. The latter part of the game has a lot of problems that are going to need a ton of attention for the game to be properly polished for anything close to a full release. Considering one of this developer's previous games, Craftopia, has been in early access for more than 3 years now. Despite maybe never seeing a full release, I do expect them to continuously update the game, but I wouldn't hold your breath for a completely finished and polished product. It's likely not to come anytime soon. Not to mention, Palworld has a lot of jank and will also probably stay that way for a long time. Anyways, we'll dive deeper into the core of my issues with Palworld, the late game, a bit later. But first, as usual, I think it's important to see the game in a little more detail. This way, once we see how it works, we can better understand why these issues occur and ultimately how to fix them. Before we begin, there's the issue of difficulty in Palworld, and by this I mean there's a few different settings that can be set up for the creation of your world. I highly recommend playing on normal or casual. I personally played on normal until I changed some settings for the game when I was at the end game around level 46, which I'll talk about in more detail later. The default hard mode settings for this game are fairly atrocious, and I'll talk a bit more on those later on. Palworld starts you out nearly naked on the edge of a remote island that looks to be the ruins of some sort of ancient civilization. The game introduces you to some weird looking lambs, cats, and chickens roaming about, and one of the first things you might do is punch one to death. And then subsequently, the game will show you how to capture them as well as force them to happily work for you in exchange for food and shelter. Yeah, it's animal slavery, but at least they look cute while doing it. You'll likely start off by making a small base somewhere and steadily exploring the area in your immediate surroundings, then quickly returning home to store whatever pitiful amount of goodies your small inventory weight could hold to make more supplies to do it again and again. It sounds a bit monotonous at first, but what really sold me to keep doing this over and over again was the feeling of progressing and wanting to see more of the world. There's tons of different pals roaming around, and some of them are completely out of your league to attempt to conquer for a long time, which really helps sell the danger that this is an actual world, and not some weird abomination where everything scales to you. As you wander around the starting area, you'll likely soon come across what is known as a Memorist, aptly titled King of the Forest. It's a huge, colossal, boss elephant-looking creature that is far stronger than you, and for the time being it will kill you in one hit, and you can only deal 1 damage to it at a time. While I absolutely despise this kind of damage scaling in games, I do imagine there was some sort of good intent behind it. But I can only speculate that they wanted the game to have more of an RPG feeling to it, and didn't want you to be able to brute force your way through with skill. But my counter argument to that would always be it doesn't feel good to interact with and is confusingly inconsistent. It's why I love games like Lies of P that don't arbitrarily lower your damage to an enemy just because you aren't the same level as them. I'm fine with having guardrails around using certain weapons, abilities, and other things like the technology unlocks. All these help you feel progression and are something to look forward to unlocking and using. They should be the primary mechanics to make you feel like you're doing more damage and not some weird damage calculation that's based on level. And speaking of leveling, each time you level, you can choose a stat increase. Your choices being HP, strength, stamina, work speed, and weight limit. And these are some of the worst RPG stat choices I've ever encountered. I can see they're trying to mix things up, but it simply doesn't feel fun or interesting to interact with. This is mostly because the best stat to increase at all times is your weight limit, meaning how much stuff you can carry at one time. It's simply the most efficient way to gather resources by creating less trips back to your base. Putting your stats into this area never feels good over anything else, it's just a necessity. Palworld should completely redesign the stat allocation system into something else entirely because it doesn't serve its purpose well enough. Weight could instead be a progression system like crafting a new bag that can hold more weight. And then work speed could also be changed into something like creating a hammer tool that you can equip that allows you to increase how fast you can work. It's pretty simple, but would have felt much better to interact with. Then they should change the stats into something more traditional like strength, dex, and int. There is a reason why this system is used over and over again, and it's because it works. Using these stats in the more traditional sense, we could end up with something like this. Strength could increase how much damage you do with melee weapons and also increase how much weight you can carry. Dexterity should increase how much damage you do with ranged weapons and also decrease how much stamina is used up while running or gliding. And finally, intelligence should increase the damage from pals and also increase your work speed. Keeping the HP and stamina stats is fine as they are. This really simple system would have been far more interesting to interact with, as well as diversify and allow for many different playstyles and builds to emerge. Instead, what we get is putting as much of your stats into weight as you can bear to handle. Continuing on this rant of how the stat system works in this game, accessories also have a scaling issue. Accessories don't give flat bonuses, but instead give percentage ones, meaning they're really only as good as how much you've invested into that stat. So getting an accessory that increases your strength by 30% doesn't feel very good when you haven't put any points into strength. Despite all these issues with trying to develop a decent RPG system in Palworld, the game still is pretty fun, but it certainly could have been designed in a much better way to make it even more enjoyable. And it's interesting to see how poorly so many systems of a game can be designed, but still end up being a pretty good time. Which finally brings us back to our big, not so friendly King of the Forest. It's things like this that make even your little starting area that you've barely uncovered feel huge and like a big challenge to overcome. And it's a huge reason as to why Palworld is such a fun game, because the real fun in Palworld mostly comes from how enjoyable the game is to explore. Exploration feels dangerous and requires you to be constantly on the lookout, which also makes it feel more rewarding, like you're braving the unknown, making it more dangerous to run around with a bag full of goodies that could be all lost within moments. Having this kind of friction that has risks and consequences in game is important, and the normal world settings do this well. But even better on top of that, if you absolutely loathe losing all your things on death, you can change it and play the game in a way you'd prefer to experience it. All of these things piling up is a big part of what makes exploration in Palworld an absolute blast. You feel constantly incentivized to explore all the different islands to find all the different sorts of pals and gather new materials to find new ways to progress your base and your character. Besides the wonky RPG settings, the other progression systems in place feel really good. Exploring to gather resources and level up in order to get shiny new toys, weapons, mounts, and funny Pokemon with guns makes it all feel worth it. The only real issue with exploration is that it doesn't feel very good to not be able to take on certain challenges if you aren't within the correct level range for an area. You may end up exploring a zone with pals that are far higher level than you, and you'll find that the challenge is a bit too ridiculously overtuned because of how the damage scaling works. So it ends up not being worth exploring at all until you're a higher level. I kind of hate this idea because it sort of removes the choice of, do I want a significant challenge right now, or do I want to level, get more gear, and come back? Instead, the only reasonable choice is to do the latter and come back, because otherwise it will be pretty miserable. Because not only is your damage lower, but your chance to even capture the pals if you get them low is a bit out of this world and will ultimately cost you far more resources to do it now rather than later. And that's the entire issue with trying to take on somewhere higher level than you, is that everything you do is dependent on how much resources you have. If they change the Pokeballs to be not nearly as resource heavy as they are to make, that alone can make these harder challenges worth taking on. Because sometimes you'll just waste a ton of balls on pals with a low chance to catch, or sometimes you'll just whiff your throw. And this can feel like you've wasted an insane amount of resources for a simple misclick or a pretty stubborn pal. The only saving grace the Palworld has here is why it's so successful, that the forced choice of gearing up and getting stronger is a pretty fun time. You'll find yourself in a constant loop of exploring, going to base 1, checking up on base 2, and then back to exploring. It's a fantastic loop that has you feeling like you're micromanaging an endless list of things to do, but in a really desirable way. Over time, all the systems they introduce start to feel pretty natural and easy to understand, and eventually you'll unlock the ability to create even a third base, and you'll want to start looking for a spot to put it. But unfortunately, you're pretty likely to realize what your bottleneck is in creating new items and tech, and you can't just place your new base anywhere. You'll want to put it next to whatever that resource is that's limiting you in making whatever you want, which will be ore. This game requires you to mine an unimaginable and unreasonable amount of ore to make and build what you want and need to. And this is the ultimate crux of Palworld. Everything you need to make in game eventually becomes ore dependent, and you have to sit there and mine most of it yourself, because there's no good way to automate doing it. Once you really start to get your base going, a lot of operations start to become fairly automatic, whether it's gathering food, stone, lumber, or just creating new items. You'll likely discover methods of having about just as much of a resource that you'll need, except for ore. It becomes an unbearable blockade in making more weapons, ammo, pokeballs, mount saddles, and literally everything. So instead of making you slave away mindlessly, grinding for hours and hours to get as much ore as you need, I think Palworld should do some redistribution of what resources are required for creating certain ammo, weapons, pokeballs, and whatever else. Because much of what makes this game feel really good to play is that once you go out and explore and come back with a big variety of stuff, all of it feels really useful in some way. But as we now know, this eventually becomes very untrue. You no longer become incentivized to explore and bring whatever home, but only incentivized to go where known ore locations are over and over again. And worst of all is that ore is incredibly heavy, so you can't even hold that much of it before hitting your weight limit. So you have to make tons and tons of trips to base and back to mining ore over and over again in order to get the amount you need. And even more annoying on top of that is that your pickaxe will break after mining just 12 rocks or so. There are some really easy design solutions to remedy this, like increasing the weight limit with the previously suggested bag progression system and strength upgrades, or just reducing the amount of ore needed for things as well as decreasing how much ore weighs. My point is that there are a ton of moving parts here that can be finely tuned to help balance how much ore mining is needed. And some amount of tweaking is desperately needed because the amount of time I spent clicking rocks felt a bit insane. Like I was grinding to 99 mining in RuneScape. Well, it's not quite that bad, but you get the idea. And on top of this problem are the bosses in Palworld, which are incredibly tanky, and for some reason bosses in the overworld just take less damage, which is incredibly confusing. But bosses in the towers take normal damage but have just an insane amount of HP. I suppose the difference here is that tower bosses don't gate you by level as much since they don't scale to you and are consistent. Although in a lot of ways they really do because of how much DPS you need to kill them, because they are unfortunately on a timer and your damage is gated by level since you need to be a certain level to unlock the best weapons. And the real problem here is that the amount of ammo this all requires, which of course means you have to go mine a bunch of ore to be made into ingots to make more ammo. So unfortunately the late game really just becomes clicking lots of rocks so you can have lots of bullets because bosses require you to have lots of ammo. This is only because the pals themselves don't do enough damage. Most of the damage to tower bosses will be coming solely from you rather than the pals, so let's take a look at the strongest tower boss to see this. He has nearly 200,000 HP, and a single rocket, which is the highest instance of damage you can do, does around 2,000 damage or 3,000 if you get a headshot with it. I used around 52 rockets in the fight, plus some ammo from other weapons, and I think I did somewhere around 150,000 damage to him by myself, or around 3/4 of his HP, and the pals did the rest. And I was barely able to complete the fight on time. It's just downright horrible that these fights are on a timer. My first attempt ended with me killing the boss just seconds after the timer ended because I played the fight a bit too safe trying to dodge every attack. On my second attempt, I made sure I was shooting at every chance I got and still only had around a minute to spare. And to make this even more extreme, if you're playing on hard mode, you'll be doing less damage, because for some reason the devs thought that was a good idea. Honestly, I don't really understand the point of the timer other than forcing you to fight the boss yourself over just letting the pals take care of it, which I don't really love the idea of. But even still, I don't really understand why there needs to be a timer. If you can beat the boss with only pals and not shooting once yourself, I think that would probably be more impressive. Mostly because it would become even more of an endurance fight and you would have to dodge far more abilities than you would have to otherwise. That said, the fight themselves are nothing to write home about. They aren't particularly exciting or fun to do, but they aren't horrible either. The combat in Palworld overall is kind of lackluster and could use a lot of improvements in making it more interesting. For instance, melee weapons are pretty terrible for boss fights. Bosses tend to move pretty sporadically and are often airborne, making it difficult to hit them with a melee attack at all. The pals themselves have really long cooldowns on their skills and are also gated by stamina, so fighting with just the pals alone is not very entertaining. Although the mounts that have special rockets and guns are pretty funny and super wacky to use, they ultimately don't do very much damage and are pretty useless to use in any actual situation and are really underwhelming for being listed as a legendary item. Not to mention how awkward it is to usually try and jump on them and use their ability in the middle of a battle. Coming back to the tower boss fights, they were fun for the first time, but after that they are all essentially exactly the same. They even have the exact same layout, where the best strategy is to use the pillar to line of sight and not get hit by abilities. And the bosses themselves don't have very unique interactions or attack patterns, which is kind of the problem with ranged combat in these kinds of games. You don't necessarily interact with the enemy too much, so they typically kind of just become a big bullet sponge. Coming back to the difficulty settings, like I said, I played on the normal default settings for most of the game, but once I hit level 46, I noticed that getting levels from here on out was going to be a bit of an insane chore to grind out, because the main method of gaining experience in Palworld is by catching pals. You get a ton of experience for catching each pal the first 10 times, and then after that you basically get next to nothing for the 11th catch and onward. So essentially you're tasked with catching 10 of each pal, which is fine until you start to run out of pals to catch 10 of. and then the grind becomes incredibly boring and long. Once I hit level 46 and saw this insane grind ahead of me, I decided to just change the XP gains by 20 times and hit max level. I don't love the endless grind in games, as you might have been able to figure out from my disdain of mining infinite ore, so I don't mind skipping a bit, especially when max level is required to finish out the game and potentially do some of the more fun things. I think normal settings need a bit of an adjustment on the XP rates, at least for level 40s to 50, because they're a bit extreme in that range, but the rates from level 1 to 40 generally felt pretty good. Lastly, there are some cave dungeons you can find scattered around the world. You can find some specific cave pals here, as well as fight some giant version of a pal and get some good rewards at the end. I think these are a great idea and add a lot to the exploration. The only disappointing part is that they are all exactly the same, just slightly random variants of each other. I think if Palworld were to take the time to actually design 20 to 40 good dungeons that are something akin to a Diablo-style maze, would make them far more entertaining and interesting to explore. These pseudo-random dungeons that all look exactly the same as each other are incredibly tiring to go through over and over again and make for a pretty bad experience after going through just one or two of them. Getting some actually fleshed out and designed instance dungeons would be a great feature that should be high on their priority list. Having well-designed dungeon areas would make exploration feel even more rewarding to do, and players would look forward to finding a new dungeon to crawl through and find new goodies in. Seeing something like a Diablo 4 dungeon without the objectives and backtracking would be really cool for Palworld. They could have chests and enemies littered everywhere for you to gain lots of XP, which could help with that problem in the late game. And speaking of Diablo, giving the boss encounters more raid or Diablo-like abilities that you have to actually interact with would make boss fights a lot more fun. Other than that, there's not much else I really want to talk about with Palworld. Although it was really disappointing to see that they set up this strange plot from the very beginning that talks about the tree being the key, and you can't even get there. So hopefully that's something that's added soon. I really hope the devs keep working to update Palworld and realize its full potential. It's impressive for an early access game, but is lacking in many areas that could be heavily improved upon to make it a far better experience. There are of course issues with things like the base management that could use a lot of work, but these are pretty small fixes that I imagine will be quickly added in over the next year or so of updates. Things like managing your pals to be assigned to a specific spot is a horrible headache, or trying to place the foundation of a base in the spot you want it to be. These are certainly issues that are annoying and make the game worse, but aren't really the kind of foundational issues with the game that are something to be concerned about long term. I see them as pretty clear issues that will get fixed eventually, as well as things like the wanted system. It's pretty horribly implemented, and I imagine it's really unpopular, so I see it pretty likely to get changed or even removed completely. Something I would be happily surprised to see changed and fixed would be their idea of an RPG system and the excessive amount of ore needed, as well as high quality pal oil. I didn't end up talking about pal oil a lot because it's not as bad as ore, but you do need what feels like an excessive amount of it. Both of these things are insane bottlenecks compared to any other resource in the game, making it a far more monotonous and boring experience than it should be. If these issues were to be fixed, I would probably pretty happily come back and play Palworld again after some updates, but if they don't, I'm not sure I'll come back. The game was fun for what it was and totally worth $30, but not fun enough for me to click 1,000 of the same rock again. But anyways, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.